So I'm reading Gianni Vattimo's book, A Farewell to Truth, which is, I believe, his most recent book. It came out in 2009 and was just translated last year and put out by Columbia University Press, 2011. So it's called A Farewell to Truth. And Vattimo is an Italian philosopher who teaches at the University of Turin. He was born in 1936, so he's about 76 years of age at this present time. And he was a pupil of Gadamer, who had written Truth and Method. And Gadamer, in turn, was a pupil, we recall, of Heidegger. So Vattimo comes out of the tradition of Heideggerian hermeneutics, and the idea that truth is essentially based on interpretation and how things are interpreted, and what the processes and the dynamics are involved in insofar as we interpret truth. Now, Farewell to Truth is an interesting title. We're sort of living in an age in which we've got this general sense now, in the age that we're living in which things are running their course. And indeed, he'll invoke one of the main discussion points of the essay that I want to talk about in this book, which is called Beyond the Myth of Objective Truth. It's the first chapter, and the one I want to discuss in this talk. He'll talk about the idea of Heidegger's essay on the end of philosophy and the task of thinking, the end of philosophy, farewell to truth. So we get this sense of living in an age in which things are winding down and finishing up. We're very possibly looking at the twilight of the atomic age now, in the shadow of Fukushima. Japan is phasing out all of its nuclear reactors. Germany has dedicated itself to phasing out nuclear reactors, and the Americans we are hesitant about building more of them. The Chinese, on the other hand, are not. But for the most part, it's looking now after Fukushima that we're entering into the twilight of the atomic age. We're also clearly living in the decline of the space age. Obama has pulled the plug on funding for NASA. NASA has in turn pulled the plug on any future space missions using space shuttles. And it doesn't look like any manned missions to anything will happen anytime soon, if ever. And of course now we're looking at the end of art and culture, and all these things are winding down, falling apart, and crumbling. And so Vattimo's book really does have a sense about it of concern and anxiety over the fate of the figure of the philosopher in an age in which everything is crumbling, including the traditional role of the philosopher. Now, what that role was, the traditional role of the philosopher, as typified by Plato, is the one who has access, uniquely so, to the objective realm of truth. Just as Plato had access to a realm of ontologically guaranteed ideas that form the ontological substratum of which the shadow world was made up of copies, and the philosopher's uniquely privileged access to this realm gained him a certain authority in which he could then advise the heads of state, politicians, on good political decisions, since these decisions would then in turn be grounded in this objective order of ideas that the philosopher anchored himself in, this kind of foundational thought for philosophy. That is the traditional role of philosophy and of metaphysics, at least down to Heidegger. Heidegger announces the twilight of metaphysics, by which he means more or less the end of Platonic metaphysics, the end of the idea of the philosopher having access to a uniquely privileged objective realm of truths, in which the primary theory of truth that Heidegger rejected is the correspondence theory of truth, in which knowledge is the adequatio of intellectus ad rem, the adequation or the conformity of the intellect with things. This is a matching theory of truth. And Vattimo now, I'm discussing this as background to the essay, but Vattimo also discusses these ideas in the opening pages of his essay. So we're actually already into the essay now in considering these ideas. And so truth is something that in this traditional idea is the correspondence, the matching of our actions or our ideas with some type of objective order. And Nietzsche had described, and Vattimo invokes this, Nietzsche's book Twilight of the Idols, where there's an essay that occurs in that book on the fate of the real world and how it turned out to be a myth after all, in which he describes the gradual disintegration of this authoritative nature of truth. First he starts with Plato, and he says with Plato you have the objective realm of truth, what Heidegger will call being, is the realm of the forms, the ideas, to which the philosopher is uniquely privileged. After that comes Christianity. The truth is attainable only after this life. It's still there waiting for us, but at the end of our lives we'll arrive at it and to it. And then later, eventually, with the decline of Christianity, by the time we get to Immanuel Kant, truth is no longer something that is out there and that we can ground our ideas and actions upon. Truth is actually in here now. Kant interiorizes this ontological ground of being by saying that it's the structure of human reason. It's the structure of the way the human mind is set up that becomes the universal foundation of our actions and behavior and the way the human mind thinks. So he internalizes this ontology, this ultimate ground of being. But nonetheless, it's still there. Then with positivism and the rise of Auguste Comte and the systems of positivism, we'll get the idea that only the scientist really has uniquely privileged access to truth, because that which is true, which can be put into a laboratory and proven, tested and therefore proven. And so by the end of the 19th century, the philosopher now is getting pushed off the stage, bit by bit, slowly pushed off the stage as science comes on stage, and it begins to become thought that only the scientist has this kind of privileged access to truth that once used to be the domain of the philosopher. And so by the time we get to the 20th century, philosophy is beginning to get a little bit anxious about its role now. It's beginning to become potentially, the practice of philosophy is beginning to become, as it actually has become, largely superfluous. And so the fate of the philosopher nowadays is somewhat similar, I think, to the fate of the artist, in that society now regards both the philosopher and the artist as utterly superfluous, has no need of either one of them, since in the case of the artist, it is assumed that with the breakdown of these objective ideas about what constitutes the beautiful, what constitutes the sublime, art is a subjective undertaking now in which anything art can do or say, anything that it wants to be art, can be practiced and put out and put on display, whether it has any meaning or significance or not. And so the public no longer trusts the artist anymore as giving us a uniquely privileged view of the ontology of being, the way Heidegger had said that the role of the artist was to illuminate being, to pull it out of unconcealment so that we could see what the presuppositions were for what we think is true is in the particular age that we find ourselves embedded in. And so nobody really trusts the role of the artist in this sense anymore, any more than they trust the role of the philosopher ever since postmodernism and the French began to deconstruct these ideas of ultimate authoritarian metaphysical thought systems. With those disintegrating, the philosopher is no longer trusted, and both he and the artist have become dangerously superfluous. The culture industry now takes over the role that was once provided by the artist, and so the artist has really become a kind of I think of his role as most typified by the role of the artist Banksy, this guy who goes around, he's wanted by the police, and he goes around the city defacing monuments, putting graffiti art all over the place. That is the role of the artist now. He has now immunologically become suspect, and the immune system of the city now targets him as an antigen, basically a viral threat that must be eliminated at all costs, and his contributions are not wanted by the city itself. They may be wanted by some of the people in the city, but not by the city itself, in the same way in which we can say, the artist has become a kind of criminal now, in the same way that Caravaggio was once, he was an actual criminal, but his art was regarded as absolutely essential to the Catholic Church in those days as a new mode of making the truths of Christianity palatable to the common person by making it very realistic and concrete and down to earth. So Caravaggio is the first criminal artist, the first one to become questionable, to begin to challenge the canon of aesthetics about what art ought to be. He was nonetheless still regarded as essential to the undertaking in those days. Now the city, with the rise of the culture industry and advertising and the arts and film, no longer has any need for the artist. And so the artist is in a desperate situation, and so too I think the same thing can be said of the philosopher. The philosopher is regarded as suspect, superfluous, and as someone who could hardly be thought of anymore today as advising politicians what to do in political situations. Politicians simply, they're going to do what they're going to do in terms of political decisions, in many cases pandering to the masses and to the democratic order of what it's expected a politician will do, but the philosopher isn't consulted anymore. And I think one of the issues that Vattimo wants to know in this essay is, in light of all this, what is the role of philosophy to politics now? What is the role of the philosopher today? What happens? And so he starts by examining Heidegger's essay on the end of philosophy, and he says, in that essay, Heidegger had said that philosophy had attained to its completion we're living in the epoch of the end of philosophy, because in that essay, Heidegger points out that philosophy is today, and this was in 1964 when he wrote the essay, that philosophy finds itself today in a role that is very similar to what happened to ancient philosophy when, after the great period of the pre-Socratics and the rise of Plato and Aristotle, philosophy disintegrated into all of these different sciences. With the rise of the academy and the lyceum, we began to get the disintegration of philosophy into these specialized disciplines: mathematics, logic, rhetoric, aesthetics, politics, ethics, the different kinds of sciences that Aristotle writes about. And Heidegger says in this essay that this is not only the end of philosophy, it's actually its completion. And the same thing happened to philosophy all over again as it began to move into the 20th century, and we began to get its disintegration into the social sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, all of these different areas of science, which now, as they rise, enrollment in philosophy classes at universities has substantially declined. With the rise of these other disciplines and these other domains of beings, as Heidegger puts it. And this has tended, with the rise of these new sciences through the course of the 20th century, this has brought philosophy to its end, especially the metaphysical phase of philosophy has come to its end, its completion, its fulfillment in the age of the what Vattimo calls brilliantly in this essay, the technological schizophrenia, that is to say, the splintering of thought into all of these different expertocracy systems. And indeed, Vattimo says then that this goes, as this is happening, this process that Heidegger identifies, there is obviously another task for philosophy, as the title of the essay says, the end of philosophy and the task of thinking after the end of philosophy. So there is a task there, and it's this task that Vattimo will be concerned with in this essay, is that what happens in the end of philosophy, as we have seen, the end of philosophy, it's disintegration into this technological specialization, and what Vattimo will be concerned with is this idea of the fate of philosophy and its relationship to politics, and specifically he has this idea that the philosopher now becomes an ontologist of the actual. This is a phrase that he borrows from Foucault. So what does he mean by the ontology of the actual? First, he says that with the disintegration of philosophy, we also have at the same time the victory of democracy, and he says that the two are interrelated because the traditional idea of philosophy, which went along with the correspondence theory of truth, the idea that the philosopher had some privileged access to the domain of the absolute knowledge, and that society was something that was based on imitating this order. And I would posit this point to say too that this idea of matching, of correspondence, goes all the way back. It's one of the oldest ideas in the history of civilization, that society exists as an imitation on earth of a macrocosmic realm of truth that is made evident in the heavenly bodies and the mathematically predictable way in which those heavenly bodies behave. This was the idea of the revelation of a cosmic order to which the priest and the shaman had uniquely privileged access, and which it was the job to inform the rest of society about the will of the gods. And this, of course, leads to authoritarian thought systems, very often backed up by military force. You will behave in accordance with the cosmic order. In Egypt, this cosmic order was known as Mot, and it was the way. The goddess Mot was the goddess of truth. It is the way the cosmos works, and any deviations from this are to be met with punishment. As the Egyptians, for example, regarded the pharaoh Akhenaten as the great heretic, the one who departed from this way, this absolute cosmic order that had been the norm in Egypt forever. And he departed from that order and was subsequently, with his own authoritarian thought system, his own cult of the sun, backed up by military force, where he sent all these armies out across the land to chisel and destroy all the images of the older gods that had authenticated this authoritarian divine order of being for 3,000 years in Egypt up to that point. And after Akhenaten, after the collapse of the city of Akhenaten and the world that he built, he becomes the great heretic, the one who is punished by Mot with repression into forgetfulness, and he becomes repressed. He is not spoken of in subsequent records, and his name is never mentioned in the succession of the pharaoh lists, and so he meets with punishment because he departed from this idea of an authoritarian order of absolute truth. And this has been the way, this correspondence theory, the idea that society corresponds to or matches through imitation a cosmic order, has been the basic idea, the informing idea of civilization right all the way down to the time of Heidegger.